Welcome to the Kwok and Roll podcast. I'm your host, Kwok Pui Lan. Today's guest is Dr. Martin Nguyen, who is teaching religious studies at Fairfield University in Connecticut. He is a scholar of Muslim theology and Islamic studies, and his most recent book is Modern Muslim Theology. In this episode, we will discuss the religious roots of the U.S.-Israel attack of Iran and the expansion of the war to other Arab countries. We will also discuss what Martin has been involved in several years in the discussion of constructive Muslim thought and engaged scholarship. Welcome to the podcast, Martin.
Thank you for having me.
I would like to begin by asking you about your reactions to the current war in Iran.
In some ways, the attacks on Iran came a bit of as a surprise, but also in the same breath, it was unsurprising, just given the escalating rhetoric that we've been hearing coming from the administration. It was one of those things I hoped wouldn't have happened, but it's taken place. And I fear that this war that's beginning to unfold, we're many days out now from when it started, is going to be drawn out and not going to lead to the outcomes I think anybody involved really is seeking. I think we're going to see a lot of tragic loss of human life. I think we're going to see long-term consequences of this conflict.
There are different branches of Islam. You have the Shiites and you have the Sunnis. Please help us understand these different branches and how it may shape the conflict in the Middle East.
Sure. If I may just quickly say, when you look at the Muslim world, there are two major sects or denominations, the Sunnis and the Shi'is. And when you look at this region, the vast majority of the Middle East and North Africa would identify as Sunni Muslim. And yet there are prominent Shi'i communities, minority communities in places like Iraq and Lebanon, Syria and Yemen and elsewhere. But Iran stands out because it is the only Shi'i majority country in the region and in the world. And of course, we can talk about this, but it's also a theocratic nation, a regime that is built around the Shi'i clergy to a certain degree. The difference between Sunnis and Shi'is really boils down to a very strong difference of opinion. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of the faith, Sunnis had a different idea of how to choose the next leader of the community, whereas Shi'is disputed this and said the Prophet Muhammad, before he passed, very clearly designated a successor, a leader of the community. And this person would be designated an imam. It's a title. And then that has been passed down from one generation to the next. And so within Shi'i Islam, they have a belief that the imams are the leaders, the spokespeople of the Muslim community, both in political and a religious dimension. Whereas within the Sunni world, there is no counterpart to that. There was very much a divide between the religious scholars who have religious authority and then political authority held by caliphs and sultans and all sorts of other types of rulers. And so we're seeing today the only Shi'i majority country in the world in conflict, being attacked right now by the U.S. and Israel.
And do you think that Islamophobia also plays into the shaping of the American impression about the war and especially about Iran?
Oh, most certainly. I think Islamophobia has been a long percolating, long present dilemma, presence within the West, especially the United States. I think for many of us, we might think of 9/11 as a bit of a watershed moment where Islamophobia really comes into being. And I would argue, while it certainly spikes, it was certainly present before that. That what we're seeing with Iran is a return to a fairly intense period of Islamophobia that goes all the way back to 1979. And so when we look at the current war, I would argue that it very much comes into being because of Islamophobia, because it is not just feeding cultural outlooks, but is informing, I think, political decisions that we have entered into this conflict. I think the days, weeks, and potentially months to come will be very much inflected by Islamophobia. And of course, when we speak about Islamophobia, I'm talking about not just anti-Muslim bias or a type of anti-Muslim racism on an individual level, but something that is actually much more systemic, something that you find embedded within a society. And so I would say before 9/11 and the war on terror that emerged in 2001, You can go much earlier by a couple decades. And I think 1979, it was really in that historic moment when Islamophobia began to make its way into policy decisions, into the administration, and something that will embed itself so that it reactivates when we get to other moments like 9/11 and 2001.
I know that you are preparing for a teach-in your school about this war in Iran. Can you tell us how you prepare for this teach-in, what you will be talking about?
With current events unfolding, we're preparing a teach-in on Iran. I'm doing it with several faculty members, colleagues of mine, a historian, a political scientist. As a scholar of religion, I'm going to try to bring some basic literacy to the landscape, talking about differences between Sunnis and Shi'is, talking a bit about the theocratic regime that's actually in place. For example, on the first day of the attack, Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, was assassinated. And that was part of this whole idea that we can decapitate the government and see the change that we want, at least from the US administration's perspective. But of course, when you actually look more closely at it, that theocracy is actually structured like any government with all sorts of different branches, that it's not going to be so easy to see that type of regime change that I think the current administration is desiring. So I'm hoping to address issues like that as well. I hope to actually track a bit of the history leading up to the moment. If I may, just to share a little bit of that, I think the reason the Islamophobia in the US exists, especially with respect to Iran, has to do with the fraught relationships between the US and Iran. And all the way back in 1951, there was a prime minister in Iran who was elected named Mossadegh. And during his term, he tried to nationalize oil. It was under British control. Today, that company is known as British Petroleum, BP. The British didn't like that idea, and they called on the US to apply pressure. Eventually, that campaign escalated to the U.S. orchestrating a coup to overthrow this democratically elected prime minister that put in place the Shah of Iran, a monarch that was essentially a puppet of the U.S. Unfortunately, the Shah ended up being a pretty ruthless autocrat. And so from that time period in 53, when the coup happened, all the way up to 79, you have this increasingly brutal regime where the Shah was using the secret police to terrorize, to torture dissent, any ounce of dissent. This led to widespread discontent that leads to the Iranian Revolution in 79. The US loses out because the revolution happens, the Shah is deposed, and then in comes Ayatollah Khomeini. Sweeps into power in 79. And then I think what really sparks the surge in Islamophobia in the United States is shortly after the revolution, the US is still trying to figure out how do they want to solidify relationships with this new Iran under Khomeini. University students in Iran take the US embassy, they overrun the US embassy and take the staff hostage. And so for 444 days, I think 50 odd US citizens, staff members of the embassy, are kept hostage for more than a year. And it's during that time period, an oil crisis is erupting because of what's happening, and then constant headlines of American hostages being held in Iran. That, I would argue, leads to maybe one of the first real concrete campaigns of Islamophobia, where you actually get it from not just at a local level, but from the administration as well. And so I hope to share that during the teach-in. Just in our conversation now, I realize I have to go even back to the 1950s when the U.S. government was surveilling the Black Muslim movement, Nation of Islam. I think there's Islamophobia, the roots of it there as well. This is all to say, I'm hoping to bring a lot more to the table just because people who are going to show up to the teach-in, my campus community, they're never going to have taken a class necessarily on Islam or the Middle East, but they want to make sense of current events. And I'm going to try to bring a bit of history and that religious literacy to the table.
Since 9/11, there has been more discussion in academia and also in the society about Islamophobia. Have you seen changes? People are talking more about it, or as you said, there are periods that people may not pay so much attention, but there might be heightened periods that Islamophobia revive and reassert itself.
I mean, even the term itself, Islamophobia, was coined relatively recently, prior to 9/11, but it didn't exist as a term way back 80s and the 70s. But it certainly has become a field now. We have scholars dedicated to the study of Islamophobia, trying to unpack it. And I think there is a greater appreciation that when you want to analyze this phenomenon, this sociological phenomenon of Islamophobia, you have to recognize that its genealogies are multi-pronged, that there are economic, political factors that feed into it, that there are state actors that are invested in maintaining that type of rhetoric, that type of anti-Muslim bias at all sorts of levels. And so it's no longer just looking at hate crimes or individual bigotry and actions. It's really trying to look at the ways that it shapes history because of the many structures that has been established to perpetuate Islamophobia. We can even go back to the 1950s. And the more I think about it, there's so many ways in which anti-Muslim bias has been developing over the course of U.S. history.
And I want to ask you, there is this word in Islam, jihad, that somehow would be so influential when people think about Islam, that is holy war or a kind of religious violence. Can you explain what jihad means?
Sure. Jihad gets used quite a bit nowadays in mainstream media, and it's often sensationalized, equated with words like holy war. But when you actually get back to the term itself, it's an Arabic word, and the base Arabic term simply means to struggle, to exert effort. The Quran uses the base word jihad quite often to simply say that one should struggle for one's faith, one should strive to draw closer to God. And the ways that it's actually used in the Quran, as according to Muslim belief, as God is addressing the Prophet Muhammad and his fledgling community, is that jihad means to endure hardship. It means to cleave closely to faith despite all the aspersions, hostilities, abuse that are being poured upon you, that you need to struggle and maintain your steadfastness. It has a sense of grit to it, of resilience. The idea that it is some sort of offensive war is not something that is rooted in the Quran. It's never used in that particular way. We do see in the Prophet's latter life, when he has fled his hometown of Mecca and gone to Medina, and now armies are being marshaled to wipe him and the early Muslim community out, the Quran gives license to take up arms for self-defense. But the idea of jihad as waging offensive war is something that emerges after the death of the Prophet, really in the early centuries when Islam is becoming an empire. I think there's a certain political theology that develops where those in power are transforming very deliberately the notions of jihad to justify campaigns of expansion. But it's not something that you find in the scripture itself. It's several layers of interpretation removed from that. But that's become popularized.
Martin, many people think that only in Arabic countries that you have Muslims, but in fact, the Muslim population spread throughout the world, and the biggest Muslim country in terms of population is in Indonesia. And you coming from Southeast Asia, can you share your social location or your history? People ask you, how did you become a Muslim, I think, right?
That comes up quite often. So I'm of Vietnamese origin, and you don't find many ethnically Vietnamese people who are Muslim. So I became Muslim. Funnily enough, when you look in the region of Southeast Asia, as you mentioned, Indonesia, Malaysia, there are very large, significant Muslim populations. There are more Muslims living outside the broadly conceived Mideast region than within it. I think only 15% of Muslims worldwide are actually of Arab origin. There are more Muslims living in places like South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, what have you. But as for me, my own religious identity and professional identity as a scholar of Islamic studies really began out of curiosity in undergraduate. I took a random course with an amazing professor, Abdulaziz Sachedina. He recently passed away, but I remember back in that class, he sparked my imagination that religion matters, which is why I ended up being a professor of religious studies. But then it also set me off on reflecting on what is out there in terms of faith traditions. And as I began to study more religions, I studied Islam more seriously and eventually became Muslim alongside my graduate studies and all that. So I hope that answers your question about how I came to be who I am.
Thank you very much. And so you have written this Modern Muslim Theology book. How is this different from other books that focus on Islamic culture or history?
When I wrote Modern Muslim Theology, I knew I was envisioning a book that would be fairly different than what you find in Islamic studies broadly. And in some ways, I think of what I'm doing, Muslim theology, they actually doing of it, constructing it, trying to speak as a Muslim within the tradition, articulating a vision of theology that other Muslims can turn to, that my community of faith can turn to, is not the norm. Oftentimes, when you think of Islamic studies, you're thinking of anthropological or historical analysis, studies that are often done at a distance, or textual analysis. But I wanted to write as a Muslim. And I have to admit, I was deeply inspired by the works of my Christian colleagues who do theology all the time. For them, it is second nature. This is just how the field is, that you can speak as a feminist Christian theologian. You can write as someone who's doing post-colonial work. You can do things that are dedicated to environmental justice as a Christian. And I felt that within the academy, there doesn't seem to be that space within the Western academy. And so modern Muslim theology is my attempt to try to do a couple things. It was my attempt to try to invite others to imagine this is what we could be doing, that we Muslims who are engaged in the Western academy can be producing works that address the issues that matter to us in our communities. And to think creatively, to think imaginatively of how we might be addressing the different dilemmas we see around us, the structural challenges around us, and yet do so within those broadly conceived confines of what the academy is, that we're producing works that we're going to review, that are going to be vetted, that will spur discourse, spark imaginations. And so modern Muslim theology, I hope, does that. I'm trying to have people reimagine, what does it mean to discuss revelation? God addressing us in the world. What does tradition look like? Rather than looking to sociological definitions of it, I try to imagine the tradition as something alive that is made with every generation, that those of us living now have as much a part of it as the generations prior. When I wrote Modern Muslim Theology, I was trying to lay the groundwork of what this work could look like. But now I'm trying to articulate what is the next step for myself. What does constructive Muslim theology look like in the years ahead? And I'm trying to address how should Muslims be responding to structural racism that is so rampant, not just in this country, but globally. We have a massive migration problem as our climate collapses, as wars like the one in Iran are erupting and elsewhere. People are on the move, right, for their own well-being and safety. And yet that causes all these tensions. How can Muslims who are both implicated in these problems, but also the victims of it or subject to it, how can we respond? What are the ethical possibilities? What does the ethical horizon look like? And so I'm trying to bring more people like myself, Muslim academics, to the table to generate this type of work. But I'm also trying to figure out what is my contribution going to be in the years ahead. So modern Muslim theology was, I think, the first step in that direction, at least from my view. I think others have preceded me, but I wanted to make it more forthright. Let's actually make this conscious. And I think the response has been pretty positive as of late, because I think this small field is growing.
So there will be more Muslim theologies in the future written by your colleagues, and especially from the younger generation?
I certainly hope so, yes. One of the things that I helped facilitate and organize recently was a 5-year project, a seminar with the American Academy of Religion. We created essentially a temporary unit called Constructive Muslim Thought and Engaged Scholarship, where we invited like-minded individuals to the table, Muslims who are coming from different fields, sometimes in religious studies, in history, and anthropology, who want to bring their commitments to the forefront, to shape the work, the analysis they produce. And it was impressive. You go to the AR, or for those of us in the field, and it's always a rich discussion when people come to whatever sessions that are being held. But just thinking about comparative numbers, the sessions for Constructive Muslim Thought and Engaged Scholarship, we were filling the room year after year. I think there was a lot of excitement. Grad students, early career scholars like myself, who were a bit more established, I think were inspired by the fact that we're all in the same room, motivated by the same energy. And so the hope now is that the unit has concluded. This past hour was the last of the 5 years, but we're trying to envision what does the future look like. Should we be proposing of something more permanent, maybe slightly envisioned differently, or should we be carving out a separate space to gather and meet? But I think the consensus is that we need to continue meeting. It's only when we're able to gather on a fairly regular basis that collaborative thinking emerges. And so while academia is very much a solitary endeavor, at least for those of us in this field, I think being in conversation, being able to workshop ideas has been a very vital component to that. So I'm hoping to find collaborators to move this forward. My fear was, in writing Modern Muslim Theology, is that no one would respond, just be out there in the world. But the responses have been good, and I am now seeing so much more literature appear and so many more voices, just being more assertive in that what I'm doing is Muslim ethics or Muslim theology.
What is engaged scholarship? Are you talking about more public speaking and intervention in the public square, or even you are talking about activism?
That I'm very much conscious that when we think about Muslim theology, it has to have a little practice. It can't just be purely conceptual and abstract. And I think a dimension of what this new cohort of people doing constructive Muslim thought is committed to is things like public scholarship. Not just writing for the academy, but writing for our communities of faith, and also just writing for broader publics that might be inspired or find solidarity with these types of efforts that we're trying to do. But I think the more colleagues I meet who are moved by this, they're doing their own work. They're activists themselves. They're community organizers. And that the work that we do in our communities is informing our thought and what we write and what we share. And it's dialogic. And so I think this engaged scholarship that we're trying to flag with that terminology is to show that we're very much trying to say that in addition to the theorization, the articulations of theologies, we also want to see praxis. We also want to see communities committed to this, transformed by this, that this is not a static intellectual exercise, that it actually has impact in the world around us.
Many people still have this very Orientalist understanding of Islam, thinking that it is a very ancient tradition, it belongs to a certain period, but it is not a living tradition and cannot address modern issues. What is your response to that kind of observation or comment?
Well, I think the more time one spends with the Muslim community, whether it's academics or local communities of faith, the more obvious it becomes that the Muslims who are in all around us are incredibly diverse. I think the United States is a classic example of this. You can walk into any mosque and have such a variety of opinions that the mosques that are all around your hometowns and cities are going to be just filled with people with divergent ideas and views. And what's remarkable is that Islam as a religion has actually valued from its beginning this notion that differences of opinion are valuable, are actually an asset. It's a recognition that humans will understand the matters of reality differently. And Islam is trying to make space for that. Even through travel, you will find that how Muslims living here in the US are no less committed than Muslims living in, say, Northwest China, in the Middle East, in Sub-Saharan Africa. And there's always this mutual recognition that we're all part of the same ummah, the same faith community. And yet, the ways that we go about our daily lives, the ways that we understand our faith unfolding are remarkably different, refreshingly different in some ways. Even getting back to our earlier discussion about Iran, despite it being a Shi'i community that's predominantly there, there's still a sense of solidarity that Sunnis will share with Shi'is there, especially in a time of war when a country is under assault. And I would encourage those out there who are curious about Islam to explore the different corners of it, and you will find a pretty rich array.
So as we conclude this podcast, what is your message to the American public, or your hope they will pay attention to?
In this current moment, to question the messaging that we hear coming from on high, to really focus on interpersonal relationships. Muslims are all around us here in the United States. They are members of fellow faith communities. I think taking the time to learn more about Islam, basically, and just to meet fellow Muslims will go a long way combating this long-term entrenched Islamophobia, which will persist even after this war in Iran ends. And it will have to end eventually. But I think Islamophobia will be much more harder to uproot. But I think making those personal connections, doing the work at a local level is what I hope all of us will aspire to commit ourselves to.
Thank you very much, Martin, for joining the podcast. I learned so much from the conversation.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And if you find this episode valuable, please comment and subscribe. I will see you in the next episode.